Could you cross enemy lines knowing that every step might be your last? Exclusive footage shows Ukrainian soldiers advancing under heavy fire, facing invisible traps and deadly ambushes. Amid the dangers of the front line, split-second decisions determine who lives, and just one wrong move. If you want to understand the outcome of these insane missions, stay with us.
Friend?
What you are about to see contains sensitive footage from the Ukraine-Russia conflict. It is presented strictly for documentary purposes. Ukrainian Special Forces advance in a strategic operation in the Kursk region. Images reveal Ukrainian elite troops carrying out a deep tactical action in territory controlled by Russian forces. The 6th Ranger Regiment surprised the enemy with a precise maneuver, gaining ground and dismantling fortified defenses. The operation was marked by rapid movements, calculated decisions, and effective use of light weapons and explosives, always aiming to protect their own soldiers and ensure the success of the mission. During the advance, hostile positions were neutralized, and Russian defensive structures were disabled with no chance of reaction. Throughout the mission, strategic equipment and abandoned weapons were recovered, which now serve to strengthen Ukrainian logistics. Each coordinated action demonstrates the preparedness and determination of Ukraine's special units. This was yet another clear demonstration of how preparation, intelligence, and courage shape the modern battlefield. In the midst of a brutal close-quarters battle in a trench, a Ukrainian soldier showed courage by throwing his helmet at a Russian enemy. Surprised by the unexpected action, the Russian soldier retreated in panic, leaving the trench behind. In the Toretsk region of Ukraine, footage captured by helmet cameras reveals the intensity of urban combat in the city's streets, one of the most affected areas by the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainian Special Forces of the Omega Unit, experts in urban operations, faced Russian forces on a high-risk mission to clear a school that had been taken by the enemy forces. The soldiers are constantly spotted by drones, which leads to aerial attacks, even artillery fire. Amid the chaos, a 120mm shell lands next to one soldier, who miraculously escapes unharmed. Every step is marked by imminent danger. The soldiers manage to enter the school and begin the search of each classroom. At this moment, the Ukrainian soldiers face a new challenge. A Russian drone is very close to them, and immediately they launch an offensive. Demonstrating the unit's skill and determination, they successfully shoot down the drone. The war in Ukraine, with its modern tactics and consequences, is portrayed through the soldiers' footage as they face unprecedented challenges on the front lines. The mission at the school is completed successfully, and the soldiers return safely. This video, captured by a helmet camera, reveals a moment of pure tension on the front lines of the war. A Ukrainian soldier, part of the Donetsk police, surprises a Russian soldier who was advancing, unaware of the imminent danger. The situation takes a decisive turn when the Russian soldier is detected by a Ukrainian drone, which quickly relays the location to the Ukrainian forces, who were hiding in a destroyed building. However, this would not be the only surprise the Russian soldiers would face that day. Shortly after, the reconnaissance drone spots 2 other Russian soldiers walking toward the Ukrainian position, unaware of the danger awaiting them. Thanks to the strategic advantage provided by the drone's intelligence, the Ukrainian soldier has the opportunity to set up a new ambush, now in a more calculated and precise manner. Choosing to flank the enemy, he waits patiently until the Russian soldiers fully enter his line of fire. In this footage, we see Russian forces intensifying their offensive in eastern Ukraine, with the clear objective of fully capturing the Luhansk Oblast, one of the most contested regions since the beginning of the war. In their way stands the 66th Separate Mechanized Brigade of Ukraine, tasked with holding the defensive line in a strategic sector. During the attack, Russian units managed to breach part of the trench, surprising the Ukrainian defenders. However, the response was immediate. A support group advanced under crossfire to reclaim the threatened positions. The trenches, now divided between the forces, became the site of intense gunfire and close-quarters combat.
Давай. Тихо.
The tension is palpable. Each soldier relies on constant communication to survive and understand in real time what is happening on the battlefield. While the Russians still control part of the position, the Ukrainian fighters make the critical decision: advance to clear the area.
Да, сейчас я прикрываю, ты потихонечку двигаешься, понял? По чуть-чуть.
With constant gunfire ahead, the soldiers move crouched through the narrow trenches. One leads, while the other provides cover, a military choreography where every movement could be the last. The advance is slow, tactical, measured in meters. Even under continuous fire, the resilience of the Ukrainian infantry prevails. They regroup and continue the mission to fully regain control of the position. Every step forward reveals the true cost of war: courage, sacrifice, and the determination to defend every inch of Ukrainian soil.
Юра, я тут. Я сейчас в ту нишу, слева. Давай, я подходу. Давай.
Recently, impressive videos have emerged revealing the incredible effectiveness of Ukrainian tanks against Russian armored vehicles. In the footage, Ukrainian tanks strike Russian targets at close range, destroying infantry fighting vehicles. These vehicles, predominantly BTR variants, are shown to be vulnerable to the direct hits of powerful Ukrainian cannons, resulting in significant damage. During a strategic operation near Pokrovsk, fighters from the 6th Battalion of the 12th Azov Brigade were tasked with eliminating advanced Russian positions. The terrain was extremely exposed, and adverse weather conditions made camouflage difficult, further complicating the mission. With the need for swift and precise action, the soldiers prepared for a stealthy incursion. Carrying about 20 kilograms of explosives, in addition to their weapons and protective gear, the fighters approached enemy lines, fully aware of the constant risk of detection. At any moment, an enemy drone could spot them, or Russian troops could move from their shelters and launch an attack. Upon reaching the designated area, the soldiers identified clear signs of enemy presence. Quickly, high-precision explosives were placed to neutralize the threats. With a swift retreat to ensure safety, the first detonation occurred shortly thereafter.
Пострел!
Next, the fighters carried out another round of preparation, placing an additional 15 kilograms of C4 to ensure the complete destruction of the enemy position. The mission was successfully completed, effectively eliminating the forward post and allowing the Ukrainian defense forces to progress. This operation exemplifies the precision, discipline, and courage required in high-risk combat. A group of Russian soldiers was caught while using scooters for transportation, quickly located by a Ukrainian surveillance drone. After being detected, they became targets of FPV drones, a technology playing a crucial role in modern combat. At first glance, the use of these scooters may seem like a risky choice due to their lack of protection, but in reality, there are practical reasons behind their use. In the Kharkiv region, footage captured from the perspective of a Ukrainian soldier reveals a crucial moment of tension. During a patrol operation, the Ukrainian soldiers locate a suspicious hideout, from which a figure emerges, initially causing uncertainty: a Russian soldier. The situation is of extreme caution, with the Ukrainians still trying to identify the origin of the individual. After a few questions, the soldier reveals who he is, and as he pulls his rifle, the situation changes rapidly. The tension on the battlefield is immense, and the ensuing action illustrates the harshness of decisions in moments of combat. In these images, we see a behind-enemy lines operation carried out by Ukrainian special forces in Dubrova. In a silent and well-planned offensive, the objective was simple: to neutralize a group of Russian soldiers who had been cornered in a house after an intense artillery bombardment. Thanks to the support of a reconnaissance drone flying over the area, the Ukrainian soldiers were able to gather information about the enemy's position and thus continued advancing. When the Ukrainian operators approached the house where the Russians were entrenched, the offensive began, and 3 rockets were fired at the building, clearing the way for a tense firefight. The Russian soldiers resisted the shootout but refused to surrender. There were 2 groups of Ukrainian soldiers. One maintained a more rearward position, ensuring security and support, while the other group advanced, penetrating into Russian-controlled territory. With every step, danger was imminent. The soldiers carried rifles and grenades. Some Russian soldiers were neutralized, and others were forced to retreat. Thus, the area was retaken by the Ukrainian soldiers. In the following footage, we witness a striking moment of the war when a Russian Alligator helicopter is hit and shot down by an anti-air missile. This incident, captured in stunning detail, reveals the intensity of the conflict and the effectiveness of the defense systems, with a scene that conveys the harsh reality of modern warfare. You watch through to the end. Only real ones do that. Show some love with a like.